Okay, so tonight we're going to get into science and the scientific thinking. We're going to begin with a story that took place in 1971 when 10 males near a college campus in Palo Alto, California, were arrested. Police officers went to each of their off-campus housing, knocked at the door. When they answered the door, they asked them if they were said person. They have a warrant for their arrest. They told them that they were suspected of armed robbery. The police officers arrested each of them at different locations. They brought them down to the neighborhood precinct where they booked them, photographed them, put them into a detention cell. And then from there, they put a hood over their head, and they then transported them to the nearby prison. And they placed them into a courtyard where they stripped them down naked. They sprayed them with delousing agent to make sure that they had no lice on them. And then they were given uniforms, and they were no longer referred to by name, but now they had a series of numbers across their chest, and that's how they would be referred to.
Where is this?
Palo Alto, California. Now this might sound rather odd, and also might sound like it's almost impossible to think that something like this can happen. But this is actually a psychology study that Philip Zimbardo conducted in 1971 on a group of 21 college students that were being paid $15 a day for a 2-week experiment. What Zimbardo and his team of researchers were trying to understand is they wanted to examine whether normal people might behave in extreme ways when thrust into situations that placed extreme demands on them. And by removing their personal sense of freedom, they experienced depression, crying, rioting, and when their behavior was really extreme, they were placed into solitary confinement, which was basically a closet for custodians that were refitted. This prison, and the reason they were blindfolded, took place in the psychology building in the basement at Stanford University. Today, you're not able to conduct the same type of study because it has very specific ethical concerns and violations that the American Psychological Association and also the Internal Revenue Board would never authorize, nor would they approve. But there have been studies similar to it in recent years, but not to that extreme. Zimbardo's team and himself were using an authoritarian method or manner of policing the makeshift prison, and also giving police powers to the people that were the guards. And the way he determined whether you would be a guard or a prisoner was the flip of a coin, and that's how you would determine your position. The study was meant to go on for 2 weeks to understand this phenomenon, and it also led to some prison reform as a result of it. It ended after the 6th day when a graduate student literally flipped out and they were forced to stop the study. They do criticize that study pretty significantly in modern times because they say even when they try to replicate this particular study, they're not able to do so with great success. Yes?
The reason why that is because this isn't really often talked about because it was only revealed recently that a lot of the people who were working at that experiment said that they were told to actually instigate, and when they weren't getting results, act more aggressive towards the inmates, playing the inmates.
Yeah, and
so a lot of the results were completely fabricated.
yeah, and they do question whether or not he fabricated some of the results, which comes into question ethically why you would actually publish results. They've never been able to prove that, but there is suspicion that Zimbardo and his team did falsify data. And they did coach, as you were saying, they did coach the prisoners to treat the inmates in a very particular way by making them feel dehumanized, demasculating them, and just treating them very unkindly and placing them into solitary confinement. So after 6 days, the study was halted, and then it was published. And to this day, he's both known for this really quite interesting study, but also known where his ethics were questionable and whether or not the results were really truly the way he says they were. I do think that there could be some controversy surrounding that, but in today's environment, you would never be able to also replicate that study. If, let's just assume that his results were true and he didn't fabricate it, you would never be able to deliver the same type of results, I don't think, because you wouldn't be able to conduct yourself in that type of environment the way he was allowed to. Today, you would never be allowed to do such a thing because the APA and Internal Revenue Board would put the brakes on it and it would cease to exist. You wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I was basically going to say that there's no way to replicate that type of study because they cannot do the same things because they had to make them feel as if they were completely alone and that it wasn't a study and that they were really in this prison, and you can't do that today. Today you would know that you're in a study, hey, you're going to be here, and you would feel safe.
Yeah.
In a way, your brain would still be like, I'm going to get out of this in a couple of weeks. I can go through it. It's not a big deal. But another thing that you were saying as far as it led to prison reform, if he did, the reason he told the guards to actually act the way they did was because the guards did act that way in the prisons. They did, dehumanize their inmates and all that kind of stuff. And that's why they had such a problem in the jails.
Yeah, and it's probably worth for people to consider watching a Hollywood rendition of this, which came out relatively recently this past decade. Don't remember exactly what year, but it's actually in the prologue with a link. And you can also watch it, I'm sure, on Amazon Prime or one of those streaming networks, but it's called the Stanford Prison Study. And it gives you a great understanding of what they actually went through. And of course, it's not actual footage, but it's based on what supposedly happened in the prison. I've watched it once. It's actually interesting. I have no interest in watching it again, but it was interesting to watch at least once. So let's move into the next part of the material when we talk about scientific thinking. When we think about scientific thinking, we realize it requires us to think rather differently than mainstream people, how you render decisions based on assumptions. So we are testing our ideas, and we're also observing very specific events. We become curious about it, and then we are collecting data, and we're starting to put it to the test. And we want to understand if our assumptions are right, but we need a scientific way of thinking about it that supports our idea. Now, some discoveries happen accidentally, and one of the classic experiments that people sometimes think about is Ivan Pavlov, and many of you have probably been exposed to that study when you were taking a psychology course in high school. And with Pavlov's study, he referred to it initially as responding conditioning, and it's often referred to now as classical conditioning. In short, he basically was studying the digestive system of dogs, and he stumbled across a particular finding that he wasn't expecting. And he was actually upset about it initially, but that experiment that yielded that outcome would eventually allow him to win the Nobel Prize, I believe in 1905, if I'm not mistaken. And in that study, he basically was pairing a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, and a certain behavior outcome was actually occurring. Another example of something that doesn't sound like it would make any sense is in chapter 1, they talk about depression, and they talk about an area of the brain called Area 25. And Area 25 tends to be amplified and even overactive for people that are more depressed. And what we now know to be true, but sounded kind of far-fetched at first, is that if you use deep brain stimulation with electrical currents in Area 25, you can actually minimize the incident rate associated with depression for people that experience it constantly, something you wouldn't normally think about. So sometimes you stumble across findings that you normally would not, or you might try to do something like Area 25 and see if there's a relationship with depression, see if you can minimize it. And that is the point with science. Sometimes we recognize that some ideas are rather common sense, whereas others often aren't. So when we think about common sense, we realize that there is some degree of intuition that we use. And not all intuition needs to be scientifically studied, but some of it does, and for good reason, because sometimes we are wrong based on our own initial assumptions, and sometimes the evidence contradicts what we originally think. In chapter 1, towards the latter part of it, it talked about flat earth theory. And this is basically a theory which many of you probably already know, where a group of people subscribe to the belief in 2022 that the earth is flat based on their own observation of how the earth looks flat. And that is a rational premise, and I think we could all agree to that. But we also know that the earth is not flat, and that theory doesn't make any sense. It contradicts what science tells us to be different. And if you read that portion of the chapter, which I believe was in the 3rd section, you would see how scientists tackled the problem. Imagine being on the shoreline of a beach, looking out to the horizon, and it looks flat. It's rational. But then what you see is a ship approaching as it approaches the horizon. But as it's approaching, you only see the top of the sail, not the entire ship. And as it starts to come more into focus, as it comes closer and closer from the horizon, you realize you see more of the sail, but not the ship. And then eventually you see both the sail and the ship. And that is empirical evidence to show that there is a natural curvature to the Earth's surface, something that we could not physically observe just by looking. So scientists sometimes have to test premises that seem common sense in order to prove that they're not. And that leads us to rationalism. And rationalism is the view that using logic and reason is the way to understand how the world works. And that is a rational premise. But is rationalism always rational? And that is a good question. It tells us how the world should work, but does it always tell us the way things should be? I'm always reminded about Karl Marx, the philosopher that wrote the Communist Manifesto. I don't prescribe to Marxism, of course, but he's certainly an interesting read because you realize that there are certain aspects of every culture that subscribes to some of his teachings, and it's worth noting because when you see these things, you could be in a better position to defend your own position or maybe subscribe to his. And I certainly don't subscribe to it, but one of the things that I thought was interesting after studying Marx, he said, as a philosopher, philosophers are always philosophizing on what things should be. But the point is to change things. So what good is philosophizing unless we are actually putting it into action? And I think that that makes a lot of sense because it goes right in line with rationalism. And we also realize that some of the great thinkers of time have subscribed to rationalism, logic and reasoning. So let's just take Aristotle, for example. I think I mentioned last time that he believed that when gas collected around the heart, it was the source of the personality. Now, today that sounds kind of foolish, and we wouldn't even prescribe or subscribe to a premise like that. But back then, it made a lot of sense to the ancient people. Now, he was right about a lot of things, but he was also wrong about some things. Take this, for example. Aristotle believed and argued that heavier objects should fall to the ground at a faster rate than lighter objects. That seems reasonable and rational, doesn't it? It took 2,000 years before an Italian by the name of Galileo Galilei would emerge onto the scene, and he was thinking about what Aristotle wrote about and his findings. And again, rational and reasonable. He decided to put it to the test in Pisa. And Pisa is where they have the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And he went up to the top of it, and then he dropped 2 balls of different weight to see if the rate of speed would be different. And he found the weight of these objects is not affected by the rate of speed when falling. And he was able to offer history, or Aristotle's work, its first major revision in just over 2,000 years. Quite interesting, right? So things that seem rational at times sometimes need to be put to the test because they could be wrong. Flat Earth theory is what I highlighted, and then also the law of motion according to Aristotle. So we realize that our senses can be fooled. A great example is watching a magician. And when you're watching a magician, you realize what you're seeing is not always what you are seeing, because there's illusions that are built into the trick. And that's the point. Our senses can't always pick up on things. It doesn't mean that somebody in the audience doesn't get it or pick up on it, but for the most part, our senses can lead us to wrong assumptions. We should also be mindful that a limited amount of observations should not be grounds for us to generalize across a wider population. And an example that they use in the book is going to a foreign country and somebody being rude or nice to them. I like to use Paris as an example because I've had the fortunate experience of traveling there 3 times, and I'm making my 4th trip this summer to Paris and the neighboring region. And what's interesting about that, I usually have people, when I talk to them, say, is it true that the French people don't like Americans? And that's usually what people hear. And when I was reading this text, that's what I was thinking about, because people usually take a couple of interactions with people in a foreign country, let's just say Paris, and if you get a few people that are rude to you, which there will be, and I've experienced that, you can't generalize it across the entire Parisian culture, because you will also come across people that are rather nice, polite, and cordial to you. I do think that people tend to be a little bit more, let's just say, rude, or they just basically end the conversation rather quickly if there is a language barrier. I find myself doing that even here. When you're talking to somebody that doesn't understand English very well, and you're not bilingual or trilingual, for example, is there a tendency to disengage or engage in that conversation? I think there's a natural tendency to want to disengage, right? Because you don't understand. And then you say to yourself, I wish I did understand, but I don't, so what's the point in talking to them? There's that natural tendency. Give me a clap if that makes sense to you. So we recognize that we cannot take a couple of assumptions or observations based on our experiences and then generalize it across a wider population. Because as we start to experience more things or more interactions, we're more likely to find other people that are going to be just as generous with their time and also interact with us in a friendly way. And that's the point. But here we find that our limitations are limited. And same thing with our observations. Now we go to 3 of the sciences: physical, biological, and also the social sciences. What we find here is when we think about psychology being a core science, it's organized around other disciplines. But even though it's organized around other disciplines, it's also organized around other schools within the college system or collegial system. Take natural science of things. We have physics. We're studying physical properties like light and also sound, for example. Geology is the study of Earth, and we realize that certain areas of the Earth will actually cause genetic shifts to occur, and it can change the very trajectory of somebody's development, as an example. And then we have chemistry, molecules. We have astronomy, light, and stars, for example. And we realize that natural things have an effect on us as well. Biological sciences is another area. So we're looking at the study of people's biology. We're looking at our genetics, both DNA and also genes, and what happens when there's a methylation process. And when the methylation process happens, how does it affect gene expression when it attaches tiny molecules to the outside of genes? And then we have botany, plants, and let's not forget about medicinal plants that serve to heal as well. And then we also have zoology. We're reminded of that because we share genetic history with many of these animals, actually all of them. There is some genetic history that we share with them. Just to give you an example, we share 50% of our DNA with plants. 44% of our DNA can actually be traced to a banana. We share 99% of our DNA with a chimp, 98% with a gorilla. Let's not forget about a pig, which is 98, and a dog is at 84%. And a zebrafish, it is at 70%. Quite extraordinary. We now know from the Human Genome Project that we know more now about genetics and how we are more similar across species and even plant life than we ever could have imagined, which makes the work of Darwin and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who wrote about the transmission of species, and then Darwin writings on the origin of species in 1859. And then we have Herbert Spencer writing just a decade after Darwin about survival of the fittest. Now those ideas don't sound so foreign to us anymore because we now have the scientific proof to back up much of what their claims were. And then we have the social sciences. And the social sciences are taking four important areas that I think you guys are going to resonate with. We have anthropology, the study of humans, culture, study of us, and going deep into our ancestry to understand it, even as far back as the Stone Age. We have psychology, the study of thought and behavior. We also have economics, and economics is really powerful because we've got social structures and organizations that are set up that affect the way we behave. Economics is a very powerful driving force that causes us to do things that we want to do and causes us to do things we don't want to do. And when I say causes us to do things that we don't want to do, let's say it in a very open and also in a way that is actually a good thing because it provides more money. I don't like working two jobs. I detest it. I really do, because it takes so much of my time and energy. But yet I do it because it provides me with a wage that is much higher when I take into consideration both my first and second job. So the trade-off for me is I'm willing to give up more of my personal time to a degree to earn more money so I can have a better existence, right? So that's a good example of what I'm referring to, and that drives my behavior, and that's the point with economics. It is a mechanism that drives people's behavior to do things that they ordinarily would not consider doing. And if the cost outweigh the benefits, maybe they don't do it, but if the benefits outweigh the cost, like in my example, I'm willing to do it, and I've been doing it for 8 consecutive years. I will admit I'm getting tired, and eventually I'll have to just get one job and just take it that way, because the amount of energy that you need to do that and work constantly over 60 hours a week is exhausting. But then we realize sociology as well, where you are interacting with groups of 2 or more people, right? And you find that when you take these 4 disciplines in the social sciences, you realize that they're all interrelated, right? And then when you realize that they're interrelated with the biological sciences and also the natural science of things, you realize, wow, it makes sense to have a liberal arts education so we can understand very foundational and basic things across disciplines, so we can engage differently with the culture that we are in, and also to sound interesting to some degree when we talk to other people, right? And last week we talked briefly about psychophysics, which grows out of the physical properties that physics focuses on. Just another reason why we should take stuff like that a little bit more serious. And then we have the scientific thinking. And scientific thinking is a good thing, and it requires us to be different. It requires our thinking process to change to some degree. And it says here, keep belief and evidence distinct, make testable claims, evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence, try to disconfirm your idea after it's been confirmed, and have your belief follow the best evidence. And that's what's required with the scientific evidence and scientific thinking. So we're going to keep the belief and evidence distinct as we develop a set of cognitive skills that will allow us to generate, test, and revise our theories accordingly as we start to develop them. And when you initially develop them, you're going to find that you're going to continue to develop them even more so. And then you're going to have to challenge those assumptions, and you're going to have to rigorously try to disconfirm what you are trying to prove, because what there is a tendency for scientists to do is to try to prove the assumptions that they are making, which means you're willing potentially to falsify data, compromise on the ethics behind the research you're trying to conduct, which will eventually become the basic research that is published in journals. So we also have to make sure that our claims are testable. And what that means also is that, are we going to use scientific testing to test our assumptions, and how are we going to look at the data? Are other scientists, once it's communicated to the peer review articles and maybe communicated to conferences that we visit, are these scientists going to be able to replicate these findings? If they can replicate them, great. If they can't replicate them, there's a question mark, right? And there's a change in the way we're looking at scientific into the experiments that have been published, and I'll talk about that in a short while. And then we have to evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of the evidence, and there's a variety of different ways that you can do that. And after disconfirming, then we have to allow our belief and see where the evidence takes us. What's interesting about this too, there's a natural tendency when you do research to want to try to push your findings in one direction, because there's that tendency to never want to be wrong. But one of the things that I want to stress, and that's why they say you have to rigorously try to disconfirm it, think about Ivan Pavlov, who developed classical conditioning. He stumbled across it accidentally. He could have easily walked away from it. He was really bothered by it. But the more he interacted in that environment, he realized that these dogs started to have psychic secretions. That's why they were drooling. And then he realized they weren't psychics. They didn't know that food was coming. There was an association that the dogs were making between unconditioned stimulus and a neutral stimulus. Some of these findings they stumble upon because they spend countless amount of hours, or hundreds of hours, if not thousands, working on the same thing, and eventually something is going to appear that is different, and it allows them to make their mark in science. So not all studies that don't work out the way you initially want them to doesn't mean that they're bad studies. It just means it might be something different. And there's examples that they provide in the book, which I hope we have some time to talk about once we get to the right point. So that leads us to replication. And if you can replicate a study, that is a good thing, because replication means that you're following the scientific process. Now, interestingly, I'd like you guys to remember this case study that they talk about here with Dr. Wakefield. Dr. Wakefield is important because he's a medical doctor, and he was saying that autism was the result of vaccinations, and the vaccinations that contributed to higher degrees of autism were associated with measles, mumps, and also rubella. He had an unrepresented sample of 12 kids. That was one of the biggest problems right there. His sample size was too small. And how he got the sample size was also another concern, but it doesn't state how, they just mention it. He published his findings, and as a result of his published work in the journals, and then the newspapers ran articles based on it, many parents then decided not to give their kids vaccines for those 3 illnesses, mumps, measles, and also rubella. As a result of that, many kids actually died because of his work that was published. After 7 long years of scientists trying to replicate his findings, which they were not able to, they were able to disconfirm his paper, and they withdrew it. I'm sure he lost his medical license, but they did not say that. So there's an ethical issue there too, and being a medical doctor, you've got to take the Hippocratic Oath. And now he's in every psychology textbook, but not in the most flattering of ways, right? And that is a study that I'd like you to remember, because when they try to replicate his work, they were unsuccessful. Now, the scientific method is a series of procedures, and I would like you guys to remember this acronym, OPTIC-R. This is going to be a very important acronym for you to remember moving forward, because it is the various processes or a set of procedures that are put into place for us to understand what to experience. So the first 2, which is observe and predict, that is basically going to set the expectation for the researcher as they go through the study. And that expectation is either going to be met or it's not going to be met. On an exam, you might find the question similar to this. What is the third step of the scientific method? So if you remember Optic-R, you're going to look at the third one and you're going to say testing. That is an example of what you could expect. So make sure you commit Optic-R as a reasonable acronym to remember the scientific method. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to develop a theory. And it says that a theory is a set of related assumptions from which testable predictions can be made. And a testable prediction is basically a hypothesis. This is setting the expectations of what the research is meant to try to answer. So an example here, for a theory, which is going to be on the next slide, is they want to know if female rodents who drink caffeine are more likely to couple with male rats compared to females that don't drink caffeine. And then they're going to measure the activity, which is, do they couple? And then they're going to determine whether or not their findings are true or whether or not to disconfirm their findings and move past it. And this is a real study. But then they also have to understand, how are they going to measure it? How much caffeine should the rodent have? In the control group of rodents, they're not going to have any caffeine. And how do they behave as an outcome? Most importantly, in a study like this, we share about 99% of our DNA with rodents. So then, is it possible for us to then generalize the study's findings across humans, which would give us insight in whether or not a female who drinks caffeinated products would be more or less likely to couple with a male? See how they start doing that? Kind of interesting. So let's look at the scientific method. Again, we're going to look at Optic-R. The first thing scientists are going to do is they're going to observe. They're observing something that seems interesting. And they're noticing that maybe females are coupling with male rodents. So then they want to know, can we potentially predict in our hypothesis whether or not females would be more or less likely to couple given a reasonable amount of caffeine? From there, they're going to test their prediction and they're going to collect data. And when they collect the data, they then are answering the question, what does the data tell us? Do they couple or do they not couple? Or does caffeine not make a difference? From there, they're going to run a series of statistical tests to determine what the relationship is and to determine whether or not to confirm or disconfirm their results. After they analyze, they're now ready to communicate their findings. When they communicate their findings to the public, they're going to do it at a conference, they're going to do it in a journal, it's going to go through the scrutiny of a peer review team that will scrutinize your work before they actually allow it to become published. Assuming that it's published, now another researcher who's interested in replicating this study, they're going to try to replicate it. Now, here's the important thing. If caffeine does not increase coupling between female and male rodents, should the scientists be upset? No. They still need to publish it. Because maybe they decide at that point, maybe caffeine's not the thing we should use. What else do we know about humans? Do people's judgment become impaired when they drink alcohol? It does, doesn't it? So if they're given enough alcohol, might they be more likely to couple with males and females, right? you can then start thinking about that. So now you could take the research in a different direction as part of the replication, and you can then put it through the self-corrective wheel of the scientific method and then publish your findings based on that as well. Now, when you're trying to conduct research and you're trying to also determine what measurements to use, for example, you want to make sure that it's both reliable and it's valid. So if you're using a scale, let's just use my own study, for example. When I was measuring grit, emotional intelligence, and also life satisfaction, which basically looks at somebody's work and non-personal life, was it reliable and was it valid? And the instruments that I used showed through statistical testing that those instruments were both reliable and valid. So when we talk about reliability, what I want you guys to remember is the first letter is R, giving you guys a little way to remember certain things. You circle the R, and what that basically is telling you, if it's reliable, it means that the results should be consistent within a certain variance. And that's what it means. If something is valid, it means that the instrument that I used, grit, emotional intelligence, which we'll call EI, and life satisfaction, was valid. So it was high in validity. To put it in the terms of the study we just looked at with the rodents and caffeine, what they would be measuring is sex drive. So if sex drive was truly being measured the way it should and it was valid, you would say that the validity was high and it was reliable, meaning that the results should be consistent every time. Now, I don't know what the results for this study are because it doesn't actually tell us in this book, but let's just assume that the results were inconclusive and caffeine had no bearing on whether or not they would couple when they looked at the group of rodents that received the treatment, which is caffeine, compared to the control group that received a placebo, let's just say water. And there was no difference between the two groups. That doesn't mean that it's not high in reliability or valid. If we're following the scientific process the way it should be and then publishing our results, well, let me put it differently. When you're measuring the sex drive, as long as it's operationalized in such a way that makes sense, in other words, you have to say what it means to measure their sex drive. And what you think it might mean to measure someone's sex drive may actually be different than the way the researchers are looking at this topic. Just like aggression, for example. Well, what does aggression look like? If you just push somebody in the chest, maybe that doesn't mean they were aggressive. It has to meet a very specific definition in order for a coder to actually say it meets the definition, and I can say that that was an aggressive act, as an example. And you'll find that constantly in scientific studies. So validity is, if it's measuring intelligence, the scale and the measurement we're using really does measure intelligence. If it's measuring sex drive, same thing. If it's measuring emotional intelligence, same thing. And if the results are constantly consistent within a variance of error, then we can say that it was a good study and the instruments were valid and they were also reliable. And if they're not, we have to then question the reliability and validity of instruments, and we might even need to try to create our own and put it through very specific testing to determine whether or not the test that we're creating can actually pass the test for both reliability and validity. Now, what happens here is that we then talk about pseudosciences. And pseudosciences are important because the word pseudo means false, so a false scientist. And in order to be a false science, it needs to be classified in very specific ways. And it means that there's a lack of cumulative evidence or progress seen in science. In other words, what I think that is saying is their arguments 50 years ago have not evolved. Their arguments 50 years ago are still the same arguments they use today. There's no difference. Examples like that would be UFO finders, or alien abduction, for example, is what the book points out, or even telekinesis or ESP as an example. It disregards real-world observations and established facts, results, and contradicts what is already known. Could the flat Earth theory, be a pseudoscience? It makes for an interesting conversation. I had a conversation with a friend from high school 2 years ago on the phone when my brother was visiting me. Highly intelligent, he's a pilot, and he insists that the flat Earth theory is sound because he's a pilot and it is flat up there. It is not round. And I can't argue with him because his premise and his reasoning is sound. But I also know that arguing with him about it is not going to get me anywhere anyway, because all I keep thinking is Google Earth, and I'm like, it looks pretty round to me. And I know better at this point, so I'm just better off just listening to his argument, which makes for great entertainment, right? Just like astrology. And in fact, philosophy, art, music, and theology are not considered to be a science, but they're also not considered to be a pseudoscience because they don't say that they're a science. Makes sense, right? And it lacks internal skepticism. One of the hallmarks of science is that we need to be skeptical about the findings. We can't just take everything that we hear at face value and say it must be true because the person's a doctor or the person's a researcher or the person has a PhD. Those are great starting grounds, right? But it doesn't mean that they're always right. Just think it took 2,000 years for somebody by the name of Galileo to question the great thinker Aristotle. And I don't think there's a single person in this room that would be in disagreement with me that Aristotle is still considered to be one of the greatest philosophers of modern and antiquity, right? But even philosophers are bound to be wrong at times, aren't they? And that's the point. We're all flawed and we're all going to be wrong on occasion, or maybe, in my case, more than just an occasion. But nevertheless, having the courage to try to test assumptions and follow the scientific method means that you're more likely to come to a rational answer to what you are trying to figure out. So the point that I'm making there, it's not about uncovering truth. You want to actually see if it makes sense, and it's really about disconfirming your assumptions. Because if you aim to disconfirm your assumptions, you are rigorously trying to prove that it's wrong. And when you're not able to do that, it means you are now right and you're in the right direction. You see how that works? But if all you're saying is, my only interest is I need to uncover the truth, it means that you might actually manipulate data. You may not follow the scientific method the way it's meant to be followed because your goal is to get the result that you want. You see how dangerous that premise could be? And that's what they talk about in the text.